Друзі, чого очікувати від Сполучених Штатів? Чого очікувати від виборів? Сьогодні ми в Американському університеті в Києві і говоримо з колишнім послом Сполучених Штатів в Україні Вільямом Тейлором. А поки ви радієте цьому так само, як радіємо ми закликаємо вас підписатися на наш канал. Ми говоримо з послом Тейлором в рамках проєкту Інституту американістики, в якому ми запрошуємо людей, журналістів, експертів, колишніх послів і політичних лідерів на інтерв'ю. Тому, власне, so, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your time. It's great to have you in Kyiv, and I just want to start on behalf of Ukrainian civil society and media. I would like to say thank you for all your work in advocacy, in educating U.S. people about Ukraine. So we do appreciate it.
Vlad, thank you for that. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be able to have this good conversation with you and the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
So it's important to the United States. I mean, it's important to Ukraine, but it's important to the United States.
So we just completed, you just completed a meeting with the journalists, and I asked you there about the negotiations and the possible kind of second peace summit. And you mentioned a very important issue that Ukraine should kind of confirm, at least publicly, that Ukraine is considering ways to end this war. So don't you have a feeling that this is the message kind of Ukraine should be focusing right now, especially when we come into fall, winter, kind of perhaps the I would say dramatic changes after the elections?
I think it is important for Ukraine to demonstrate to the rest of the world, but also to demonstrate to Ukrainians and really to Russians that it has a vision. Ukraine has a vision of what a just and lasting peace looks like. And this peace summit, the first peace summit in Switzerland in June, was a first step. You mentioned that there have been discussions about a second peace summit. It's complicated. The Russians say they'll come to a peace summit only if Ukraine surrenders. This is not interesting. But it is important for Ukraine to demonstrate to people that they have an idea, that they know what they want, and that they build support for that idea and build support for that vision among the international community as well as at home.
I would like to ask another, I would say, very important also question. Like, basically, what should Ukrainians understand about U.S. policy in general towards Ukraine, and also about possible ways how this war might end? Basically, what issues or concerns we should be aware of?
First of all, you asked about the U.S. policy, and the articulation of U.S. policy and the U.S. goal in Ukraine has recently changed. Many Ukrainians will remember that President Biden has said that the United States will support Ukraine as long as it takes. That's now changed. That's now gotten a bit stronger. About a week ago, President Biden said, and others have echoed, that there's a new policy, a new goal for the United States in Ukraine. And the new statement is the United States will support Ukraine until they prevail, until Ukraine wins. That's an important change, and it's a strengthening of our commitment. Strengthening of the goal of what we're after. It's not just a forever war. Yeah. It is until Ukraine prevails. And that gets to your next question about how does this war end? And I've had many conversations about the past week with many Ukrainians, some in the military, some in the press, some in the government, some out of the government. There's a lot of debate about this question. And some argue we have to fight until we win. We have to keep fighting until we win. Some Ukrainians will say that. Other Ukrainians will say we can't fight forever, so we have to look for a way to secure ourselves? How can Ukraine be secure? And they come up with the idea that they could find a way to stop the war if Ukraine could be in NATO. If Ukraine was in NATO, then Russia would not attack. Ukraine would be secure. Ukraine would be part of a defensive alliance that is committed to the security of all of its neighbors, all of its members. So all 32 members of NATO now know that if Russia ever attacks, that the other 31 nations will be there to support. And if Ukraine's in NATO, it would have that same assurance. And that would be the security. And so some Ukrainians tell me this week that if they could get a commitment to be in NATO, that they could look for a way to stop the war.
Yeah, and I would say another important question in that regard is why did it take so long for the Biden administration in particular to express this willingness to let Ukraine win? Do you think that kind of the dropping out of the race by President Biden did have an influence on that?
I don't know. I don't know. It's possible. It's possible that President Biden, after stepping aside and allowing Vice President Harris to take up the mantle, it's possible that President Biden has says, Ukraine is my legacy. People are going to remember me, Joe Biden, depending on how the war in Ukraine goes. And he may, I don't know, I haven't talked to President Biden, but he may say, I want Ukraine to win because if Ukraine wins, my legacy for helping Ukraine win will be strong. But I don't know. Vice President Harris is also more aggressive in some cases than President Biden. So you're right to say it's possible that this change from President Biden to Vice President Harris as the next candidate may have had an effect on the Ukraine policy.
Actually, this year, finally, I would say US and Ukraine completed and signed the bilateral security agreement. But many in Ukraine viewed that fact that it has not been ratified by the Congress as a negative, development. Basically, what do you say to them?
The Biden administration has not submitted that bilateral security agreement to the Congress. In our law, under our Constitution, for a treaty, which this would be, for a treaty to be approved, it has to get 2/3 vote of the Senate. It doesn't go to the House of Representatives, but a 2/3 vote of senators. And the Biden administration has not submitted this bilateral treaty agreement to the Senate. Therefore, it's not binding. It's not law. Mm-hmm. If they submit it to the Senate and they ratify it, it would be law. It would be binding. Now, the Biden administration says that it is binding on as an executive order, and it's a serious document. And they take this bilateral security document as a real commitment, a political commitment, not a legal commitment, but a political commitment from the United States to Ukraine. And I know that Ukrainians would like to see it stronger, like to see it in law, like to see it a treaty, like to see it submitted to the Senate to be ratified. But for now, this bilateral security agreement, together with all the other NATO nations who have got their own bilateral security agreements, is a network, is an agreement among many nations to support Ukraine.
We are entering the election stage, and I asked you at the meeting about that, but right now I'm going to ask actually what Ukraine should do differently next time when the time is up for the next supplemental vote package in the US Congress. So in terms of advocacy, in terms of communication, and also in terms of the results that can be presented to US Congress.
So Ukraine did a very good job on this last one. $61 billion is a lot of money. And that was a major success for Ukraine. It's a major success for the United States. It's a major success for our own security. United States security, we benefit from that $61 billion that will go to help Ukraine win. It will help Ukraine financially, but also militarily. And that's important for the United States security. It's important for European security. So I think the Ukrainians did a good job presenting their argument. Again, there were Americans, a lot of Americans who were making the same argument to the Congress because it's in our interest. It's not just in Ukraine's interest. Ukraine's important, but it's also in our interest. And so the Americans were making the same case to the Congress that the Ukrainians were.
Just recently, or a couple of days ago, the U.S. again, I would say, accused China of giving very substantial help to Russia's kind of war machine. I think the track of U.S.-China competition right now in Ukraine, or China-U.S. relations, is not clearly understood in Ukraine, especially regarding this kind of new terminology that also Secretary Blinken used regarding stabilizing the relationship, reopening, strengthening the high-level Chinese-American channels of communications, and at the same time saying that China is helping Russia. How can you connect, these 2 points?
It's a good question, and you connect those 2 points by saying that China should not be supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. And if China decides to sell weapons to Russia, the United States has made it very clear that we would put the same kind of very harsh sanctions on China that we've put on North Korea and Iran. And China, unlike North Korea and Iran, has a big investment in the West, sells a lot to the West, sells a lot to Europe and the United States. So they have a much greater stake in this economic connections. So they don't want to have sanctions put on them. So they don't want to, so far, the Chinese have not sold weapons to Russia. You're right. We have noticed that the Chinese have given dual-use equipment, microchips to the Chinese, sold. But they haven't sold weapons. And that's a big, but then the other part of your question is we are having conversations with the Chinese. We are at the top, President Biden talks to President Xi. Our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, goes to Beijing. They have good conversations. Our Secretary of Defense talks to their defense minister. That's not happening with the Russians. We're talking with the Chinese. We're not talking to the Russians. The Russians are international outlaws. They are international pariahs. The Chinese have the potential to avoid conflict. And I think the Chinese would like to avoid conflict. They'd probably like to take Taiwan without a conflict. But they also, they know that if they get into a fight over Taiwan with the United States, it would be terrible for both sides. And they don't want that. And we are talking to them and they are talking to us. So we avoid that. We avoid that. And so that relationship, the Chinese-US relationship, has the possibility to stay stable, has the possibility to not go into conflict. The Russians are fighting a war against their neighbor, and that has implications for the rest of Europe and our relations. That's so different, that the Russians are the real enemy and the Chinese are the potential adversary.
In basically one of your speech at the Colorado State University last year, you mentioned the possibility of a Korea-like scenario for Ukraine. Almost 1 year has passed. Basically, how do you assess the likelihood of this scenario now, and what challenges would Ukraine face in that case if that plan or that case is?
First of all, it can't be the suggestion or the idea or the initiative of any foreigner. Can't be the idea of an American or the U.S. government or a European government. This has to be a decision by Ukrainians and by Ukrainian government, because that implies some kind of, the Korea solution, the Korea example is some kind of a armistice, kind of a ceasefire. Some Ukrainians don't want a ceasefire. I talked earlier about this, two groups, some don't want a ceasefire. Ukrainians have to decide what scenario, whether it's North Korea, South Korea, whether it's East Germany, West Germany, whether it's continue to fight until they take back all the territory. Those are Ukrainian decisions. And Ukrainians will define what victory looks like. And then we go back to what the U.S. policy now is, to be with and support Ukraine until they prevail. But Ukrainians define prevail. Ukrainians define victory.
I didn't plan to ask the next question, but at the meeting you mentioned about the so-called the Wales declaration about non-recognition policy regarding the incorporation of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. Ukraine also has the, I would say, very similar document, so-called the Pompeo Declaration in 2018.
Correct.
Kind of regarding a similar policy. Unfortunately, I would say this document is not probably well understood or communicated in Ukraine. So basically, what's its practical asset for Ukraine right now, and how Ukraine should use it wisely?
So the Pompeo Declaration, like the Wells Declaration that said the United States would never recognize the Soviet annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Pompeo Declaration says the United States will never recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea, which is part of some kind of an end game, of how the war could end. Again, President Zelensky has said that Ukraine will push the Russians out of some of the occupied territories militarily, and will get back the rest of Ukrainian territory, occupied territory, through other means, through diplomatic means, through negotiations, which means that in the end, Ukraine will take back all of its territory. And we support that. The Pompeo Declaration says that we will never recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea. So it could be part of that agreement.
Actually, don't you think that it's important to highlight, for example, for the team of the President Trump, also during the elections, that under his watch, the Secretary of State issued this kind of declaration, and it's his policy as well. So, because when we speak about possible plan that that President Trump is going to offer for Ukraine, everyone is talking about getting territories, about negotiations. But do you have an idea, what will be his red line?
I don't. I don't know. I'm not sure he does. Secretary Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, with some help from Kurt Volker, by the way, has put forward a very strong policy in support of Ukraine. And as you say, Secretary Pompeo in the Trump administration previously had a strong position in support of Ukraine. If President Trump wins, if former President Trump wins in November, and if he agrees with Secretary Pompeo, and maybe even brings Secretary Pompeo into his new administration, then Secretary Pompeo will remember that he has this Pompeo Declaration, which is supportive of Ukraine. And so, but we don't know what Donald Trump will do at this point.
My last question would be, how would you assess the withdrawal of Russian warships from Crimea or from the Black Sea, actually?
A great success for Ukraine. I mean, here's Ukraine, without a navy, has pushed the Russian Black Sea fleet out of Sevastopol, back over into the eastern part of the Black Sea, has destroyed at least a third of the Black Sea fleet.
Yeah.
You know, we know what happened to the Moskva. So that is an amazing accomplishment of the Ukrainians with their own, largely with their own, your own weapons and own drones. And that is an indication of what the Ukrainians can do. So a lot of people worry about the stalemate before Kursk. I mean, you know, Kursk now demonstrates not a stalemate, that you can. But before that, there was this worry about a stalemate, but they didn't remember, or they didn't highlight the important success that Ukraine has had on the sea, in the Black Sea, pushing the Black Sea fleet out.
My very last question would be, don't you think that even, I would say, the conversation about the Kursk operation is also important in terms of also Ukrainian advocacy in the United States in particular, as it gives some fresh air into discussions about the strategy, about the war outcome and others?
You're absolutely right, Vlad. You're absolutely right. The Kursk operation demonstrates to Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, and Russians that Ukraine can fight strong. It has the capability, it has the initiative, it has the imagination, it has the courage to take this bold step, risky step, but a bold step, and that has had an effect in the United States, and that has built support for continued support for Ukraine.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Vlad. Good to be here.
Thank you.